For centuries, naval power was measured by two simple metrics: the thickness of a hull's steel plating and the diameter of its main guns. Steaming off the coast of Malaya in late 1941, the HMS Prince of Wales embodied this doctrine. At 35,000 tons, she was built to trade heavy shellfire with any dreadnought on the ocean. But the Japanese didn't send an opposing fleet. Instead, they launched 85 bombers and torpedo planes to intercept the British task force from the air. This diagram shows the defensive gap Japanese pilots intended to exploit. Battleships carried their heaviest steel belt high on the hull to stop horizontal shellfire from other ships. However, the armor thinned out significantly below the waterline. By dropping torpedoes to run just beneath the surface, the Japanese bypassed the heavy belt armor entirely. The strikes tore holes in the lower hull, flooding the engine rooms and cutting the ship's electrical power. With her steering dead and thousands of tons of seawater rushing in, the Prince of Wales listed heavily to port. In less than 2 hours, the ship rolled over and sank, taking hundreds of sailors with her. The loss of the Prince of Wales proved that the most expensive armor plating in the world offered no protection against aerial torpedoes. Without air cover, the battleship had been reduced to a slow-moving target. The aircraft carrier became the new center of the fleet. Ships like the USS Enterprise traded heavy steel armor for flat wooden flight decks, acting as floating runways that could strike targets hundreds of miles away. In June 1942, the stakes of this shift were tested at the Battle of Midway. An outnumbered American fleet had to locate and destroy Japan's carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, before their own remaining ships were found. The SBD Dauntless dive bomber was the primary tool used to exploit carrier vulnerabilities. These planes were designed to pitch their noses nearly straight down, bypassing anti-aircraft fire through steep vertical attacks. The American attack was disjointed and uncoordinated. Squadrons struggled with low fuel and lost contact with one another, only arriving over the Japanese targets simultaneously through the friction of war and pure chance. Commander McCluskey and Lieutenant Richard Best both targeted the carrier Kaga at the same moment. As they pitched into their dives, their formations barreled down within yards of each other, narrowly avoiding a mid-air collision. Despite the chaos, the pilots held their angles. Within a 5-minute window, they landed 500-pound armor-piercing bombs on the flight decks of 3 separate Japanese carriers. These hits were catastrophic because of how carriers operated. As this deck view shows, the American bombs struck a wooden surface crowded with fueled aircraft, live bombs, and torpedoes. The impacts ignited the aviation fuel, triggering a chain of internal explosions that tore the Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu apart from the inside. Midway demonstrated a shift in the economics of naval combat. A single pilot with a well-placed bomb could now destroy years of naval engineering in seconds, making air supremacy the primary requirement for any surface operation. By April 1945 at Okinawa, air power evolved from a delivery system into a suicide tactic. Having lost their elite carrier pilots, the Japanese began stripping aircraft of unnecessary equipment and turning the planes themselves into guided missiles, the kamikaze. The destroyer USS Laffey was stationed as a lone radar picket, caught directly in the path of this new doctrine. Over 80 minutes, her crew faced 22 incoming suicide planes. The Laffey's crew maintained a 360-degree defense, using every available gun to create a curtain of flak. They had to shred the incoming aircraft before the pilots could steer them into the hull. Several planes bypassed the flak. Pilots deliberately steered into the Laffey's superstructure, detonating their onboard explosives and bathing the decks in flaming aviation fuel. The stern was reduced to twisted, burned metal. With her rudder jammed and her guns disabled, the Laffey was a wreck, but the crew managed to keep her afloat. The USS Laffey is preserved today in South Carolina, a physical record of the high casualties that defined the final months of the Pacific War. The era of the heavily armored battleship ended in the Pacific. These engagements proved that control of the ocean no longer belonged to the ship with the thickest armor, but to whichever side commanded the sky.